They said the school in Mwangaza village had stood for 40 years without ever losing its shine. But on the morning Amina was expelled for being poor, something in its walls trembled, as if the building itself sensed a great wrong was taking place within it. For the ancestors who guarded the village had long warned that when injustice falls on a child, the spirits wake like lions disturbed at dawn. And that day, as the school bell rang with its usual metallic pride, the sound seemed cracked, off-key, carrying a strange echo that made even the birds hesitate in the sky. Inside Class 3B, where Amina sat in her usual back corner, pretending to fade into the peeling wall behind her, pretending her torn collar and bread wrapped in old newspaper didn't expose her poverty, pretending the hunger twisting in her stomach was invisible to the classmates who munched on fried plantain and suya, pretending she didn't hear the whispers about how she smelled of charcoal and cheap soap. There, in that lonely desk, the air stiffened, because the prefect appeared at the door with the stiffness of bad news wrapped in a school uniform, calling her name not loudly, but coldly, and in that tone Amina already heard her fate. She stood slowly, feeling every eye watching her, judging her, measuring her worth as if her life were no more than a number in a ledger. And as she walked down the corridor toward the principal's office, she felt the school stretching before her like a long, dry well she had been thrown into, her heartbeat echoing against the walls. Madame Sepu, the principal with a sharp jaw and a sharper heart, sat behind her polished desk like a queen on a throne built from rules, fees, and pride, barely looking up as she flipped through papers before saying the sentence that would ripple through more than human ears. "Your mother has not paid your fees. You may leave this school today, immediately." There was no compassion, no pause, not even a sigh, only the coldness of someone who had never been hungry, who had never sat in class pretending her stomach's growling was thunder outside the window, who had never known what it meant to be invisible in a world obsessed with uniforms, books, and shoes. Amina tried to speak, but her voice hid somewhere behind her ribs, and she simply nodded, a small mechanical movement born from exhaustion, humiliation, and hopeless acceptance. No teacher stepped forward, not the English teacher who praised her essays, not the math teacher who once said she solved problems like someone born for numbers. Not a single adult dared remind Madame Sepu that a school is supposed to protect children, not discard them like spoiled fruit. Amina picked up her faded bag, tiny against her thin frame, and walked out through the front gate under the burning sun. And as she stepped onto the dusty road that led back toward her mother's house, a sudden gust of wind blew, dry, sharp, swirling dust around her like a warning whispered from another realm. And in that moment, the elders would later say, the spirits turned their heads toward the school. Because when a child of Mwangaza suffers unjustly, the ancestors take note, and they do not remain silent for long. As Amina walked past the market, past the mango trees where children played after school, past the old well where women gathered to gossip, there was one pair of eyes that didn't look away from her shame, the eyes of Mama Halima, the old village seamstress, sitting in front of her small wooden stall filled with folded fabric, spools of thread, and dresses repaired so neatly no one could see the scars beneath the stitches. She watched the girl walk by with the heavy sadness of someone who recognized the shape of that pain, who had once carried that same invisible burden on her own narrow shoulders, who had once been expelled from school because her mother couldn't pay, whose memory still carried the sting of a teacher saying, "Rules are rules," while her heart cracked quietly inside her young chest. Mama Halima saw the way Amina held her bag against her stomach, the way a wounded bird hides a broken wing, and something ancient stirred behind the seamstress's ribs, something she had kept buried for decades beneath cotton, thread, and silence, something that felt like a drumbeat beginning slowly in her bones. She did not call out to the girl, did not ask what had happened, did not embarrass her with pity, because women who have lived through wounds of the same shape understand that some sadness must be approached gently, like a trembling animal afraid of being touched. Instead, she simply observed, and the spirits observed with her, their attention drifting like wind through fabric, their presence settling in the old sewing machine inside her house, a machine that would not sleep that night. Because long after the sun sank behind the hills and the village lanterns blinked to life one by one, long after children finished chores and women finished cooking and men finished arguing at the bar near the football field, the window of Mama Halima's workshop glowed gold against the darkness, and the rhythmic clatter of her ancient machine echoed across the quiet street. Clack, 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 a steady heartbeat of rebellion, stitching not just thread into fabric, but intention into destiny. For while the village slept, while the school rested smugly in its power, while injustice tried to settle like dust on a forgotten wound, Mama Halima sewed under the trembling lamplight, her fingers moving with the certainty of someone guided by forces greater than herself. And somewhere beyond the walls of her home, the spirits listened, the ancestors stirred, and a whisper rose from the unseen world. This story will not end here. The next morning, before the sun fully stretched its golden fingers across the rooftops of Mwangaza, Amina walked again down the dusty road, not toward the school she'd been cast out from, but simply because her feet didn't know where else to go, carrying her small shattered dignity like a cracked bowl that leaked with every step. Her eyes swollen from crying through the night while her mother complained about bills, and her stepfather muttered that school was a luxury they couldn't afford. She clutched a tiny, dirty piece of cloth in her hand, not big enough to be useful, not clean enough to be comforting, and when she reached Mama Halima's sewing stall, she hesitated, hovering like a lost bird before a branch, before finally whispering, "Do you have a small piece of cloth I can use as a handkerchief?" But her voice broke on the last word, collapsing into silence. Mama Halima didn't gasp, didn't frown, didn't even ask what happened. She simply stepped aside, opened the door to her workshop, and let the girl enter as though welcoming a wound that needed privacy to bleed, guiding her to a wooden chair softened by years of quiet visitors, and instead of asking questions, she placed half a loaf of bread in front of Amina, careful, gentle, as if offering fire to someone freezing, and waited, because women like her know that pain must spill on its own, not be pulled out like a thorn. And eventually, Amina began to speak, releasing words that seemed to have been trapped behind her ribs for months. The torn uniform that embarrassed her, the classmates who laughed at her lunch of dry bread, the teachers who saw her hunger but pretended not to, the principal who dismissed her humanity with a sentence shorter than a breath, the loneliness in her mother's house, the weighted silence of poverty that followed her like a shadow with claws. She poured out everything until her shoulders trembled and her hands shook, and through all of it, Mama Halima listened with a stillness that felt sacred, her eyes soft yet fierce, the eyes of someone who recognized every bruise, even the invisible ones, because she carried the same map of wounds inside her own heart. When the girl finally fell silent, exhausted, expecting either pity or promises, the seamstress rose without a word, opened her cabinet, and took out a clean white cloth, soft, fragrant with soap, untouched by dust, and folded it carefully into a perfect square, then tied it around Amina's wrist like a bracelet, like a blessing, like a reminder, whispering only, "This pain is stitching something in you too, my child." And though Amina didn't fully understand, she felt the words settle into her soul like a seed dropped into fertile soil. After she left, the workshop grew unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that presses on the walls until they sigh, and Mama Halima sat down before her old sewing machine, touching its iron frame with the familiarity of holding an old friend's hand. And in that moment the air shifted, not with wind but with presence, as if unseen eyes were watching, guiding, waiting, because the ancestors knew what she had decided even before she said it to herself. She would not let this injustice stand. She would not allow the school to choke a child's future simply because poverty dared to exist. As the sun lowered, she gathered fabric, deep blue like the dawn sky, sturdy cotton that could outlive storms, and began cutting with rhythmic precision, her scissors slicing through cloth like truth slicing through lies, the machine awakening with a hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that was no longer just mechanical but spiritual, echoing like distant drums from a forgotten age. Stitch by stitch, she shaped a new school uniform. Not just clothing, but armor. imbuing it with defiance, dignity, and the silent roar of all the girls whose names had been erased from school registers before Amina. The lamp above her flickered, shadows dancing across the walls as if celebrating her rebellion, while the spirits gathered around her shoulders like guardians, breathing warmth into her tired hands. Outside, the moon watched through the window, its pale light blending with the glow of her lamp, until the room shimmered with a strange silver-gold radiance. And when dawn finally arrived, she folded the completed uniform with reverence, sliding it gently into a cloth bag as though preparing an offering rather than a garment. She straightened her back, tied her faded headscarf, looked at her reflection in the dusty mirror, and whispered to herself, "Today, they will remember that even the simplest woman has a voice." And as she stepped out into the morning light, worn sandals slapping the earth, the wind stirred again, soft, deliberate, approving, because the spirits knew that the quiet revolution she began last night was about to reach the gates of the school that had forgotten its purpose, and the world of Mwangaza was no longer the same. The morning Amina returned to the school grounds, not as a student, but as the reason a storm was brewing. Mama Halima was already walking ahead of her, carrying the cloth bag with the new uniform inside it pressed firmly against her hip, like a warrior holding a sacred artifact, her footsteps steady, slow, defiant, causing the dust beneath her sandals to rise in little swirls as though the earth itself recognized the purpose of each stride. The villagers watched from their doorways, some murmuring questions, others pretending not to see. Because when a simple woman marches toward a place of power with unwavering eyes, even gossip is afraid to follow. And as they approached the tall metal school gate, a sudden breeze swept through the compound, rustling the flag, rattling the windows, making papers flutter inside classrooms, though no one had opened them. An omen the elders would later swear was the ancestors announcing themselves. The moment Mama Halima stepped through the gate, the school seemed to stiffen, the air turning heavy as chalk dust, and her presence sliced through the buzzing gossip of teachers like a blade wrapped in dignity. She moved past the rows of classrooms where children paused mid-sentence, recognizing her not as the woman who repaired their uniforms, but as someone who had stepped into a narrative larger than herself. And without asking permission, she walked straight into the front office where Madame Sepu, surrounded by stacks of folders and the smell of polished wood, sat rigidly, her lips forming a thin line as she looked up with mild annoyance, the kind used on people she assumed were beneath her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut thread, but Mama Halima did not bow, did not fidget, did not shrink. She placed the cloth bag on the desk between them, the thud echoing like a heartbeat in the silent room, and said with quiet authority, "I am here for the girl you expelled. I have paid nothing yet, but I have brought the first truth this school seems to have forgotten." The teachers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, for there was something different in the seamstress's tone, something ancient, something steady like the first drumbeat at a ritual. Madame Sepu straightened, scoffing, "School rules do not bend for charity cases, if fees are not paid." But before she finished, the ceiling fan above them sputtered, slowed, and came to a stop, though the power had not flickered, the room sinking into an uncanny stillness that prickled the skin of everyone present. And for a brief second, even the principal felt a chill crawl down her spine. Refusing to be unsettled, she continued, "The girl must stay out until her balance is cleared." But Mama Halima stepped forward, unfolding the uniform from the bag with deliberate slowness, letting the fabric catch the light, clean, sturdy, beautiful in its simplicity, and laid it on the desk with reverence, saying, "This is not charity, this is justice, and justice, Madame Sepu, is older than your rules." Her words dropped into the room like stones into deep water, sending ripples no one could ignore. The teacher's eyes widened, the secretary held her breath, and the principal's confidence faltered just long enough for the spirits to slip in. For at that moment a gust of wind slammed a door somewhere in the hallway, though no windows were open, and the lights flickered, not violently, but with a strange warning pulse, as if the ancestors were tapping the edges of the physical world to make their displeasure known. Madame Sepu's pen rolled off the desk on its own, landing near the uniform, and when she bent to pick it up, Her gaze landed on the craftsmanship of the garment, the perfect seams, the strong stitching, the care woven into every thread, and something in her expression softened, almost imperceptibly, before pride swelled again and she snapped, "This does not pay her fees." But Mama Halima, unbothered by human arrogance, simply looked her in the eye and replied, "I will pay when I can. But you will admit her today. The spirits have seen what you did. Do not pretend they haven't." At that, the floorboards creaked though no one moved. The window glass chimed softly, and the air thickened with a quiet that made even skeptics straighten their backs. The principal's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But no words came out, as though something unseen held her tongue. Finally she exhaled sharply, turning away to hide her unease, and muttered, "Fine, she may return, for now." The teachers exhaled in relief, though none admitted they had been holding their breath. Outside, Amina waited by the corridor, clutching the handkerchief tied to her wrist, when Mama Halima emerged and placed the uniform gently into her arms. For a moment the girl said nothing, only stared at the neatly folded fabric that seemed to radiate warmth, hope, and defiance. She looked up at the seamstress, eyes filling with tears she didn't want to release. But Mama Halima touched her cheek lightly and whispered, "Wear it with your head high. You are stepping back into that school, but you are not going alone." And as Amina donned the uniform, the breeze picked up once more, swirling around her like a cloak of unseen protection. And when she re-entered her classroom, the spirits walked with her, quiet but undeniable, reminding everyone present that the child they had cast aside had returned, not as a beggar for acceptance, but as a bearer of destiny stitched in threads no blade could cut. When Amina stepped back into her classroom wearing the new uniform, the room shifted the way a forest shifts when a storm is about to break. Quiet but charged, the air thick with unspoken questions, as her classmates stared at her with a mixture of guilt, surprise, and something that looked suspiciously like fear. For children are closer to the spirit world than adults, and they sensed, without knowing why, that Amina did not return alone. The breeze that followed her inside rustled pages and lifted curtains though the windows were shut, and even the chalk in the teacher's hand snapped cleanly in two as she wrote on the board, making her pause with wide eyes as if something unseen had tapped her wrist. Amina walked to her seat without lowering her gaze, and the spirits walked with her. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady like a heartbeat. While in the seamstress's workshop across the village, the old sewing machine remained still, yet humming faintly with residual energy, as though its presence alone knew the girl's journey was far from over. After school, Amina ran to Mama Halima's house, not with the shame of before, but with a kind of trembling joy, and the seamstress welcomed her with a nod, not a smile, because some victories are too sacred for ordinary celebration. Instead, she pointed to a pile of fabric scraps on the table and said, "Sort them by color," beginning Amina's apprenticeship in the most unassuming yet life-altering way. For in the days that followed, the workshop became more than a place of sewing. It became a sanctuary where forgotten girls drifted in like feathers on the wind, some arriving with torn dresses, some with bruised hearts, some with burdens heavier than their small shoulders could carry. They came timidly at first, drawn by whispers that the seamstress who challenged the school now stitched more than cloth, that she stitched courage into those who sat by her side. And Mama Halima never turned anyone away, simply gave each girl a task, winding thread, sweeping the floor, holding fabric steady, and with each task she taught lessons disguised as sewing instructions. Pull too hard and the thread will snap. Force solves nothing. Or when the stitch goes crooked, you don't throw the cloth away, you undo it and start again. Or, fabric like people has weak spots, treat them gently. And slowly, almost invisibly, the workshop transformed into a second school. One where no girl was measured by money or mocked for wearing patched clothes. Meanwhile, something unusual began happening at the real school. Exams that once felt impossibly hard now seemed clear. Fights in the playground stopped before they began. Rainstorms that usually flooded the hallways drifted around the building like diverted rivers, and teachers found themselves speaking more kindly, listening more deeply, softening without knowing why. because the curse that had settled over the school after Amina's expulsion began to lift with each act of justice performed by the seamstress and her growing circle of girls. Villagers noticed that the children who wore uniforms repaired by Mama Halima walked with straighter backs, spoke with firmer voices, and returned home with brighter eyes, as though dignity itself had been sewn into the seams. And soon mothers began bringing their daughters to the workshop, not for free work, but for the unseen strength it offered, the kind that stitched itself into a girl's spine. And every time a girl came with a broken zipper or a ripped hem or a story she was too ashamed to say out loud, Mama Halima took the garment in her hands as though receiving a confession, repaired it carefully, silently, then handed it back with the same phrase, "Go, you are whole again." And even though no magic was spoken, the girls left standing taller, breathing easier. One evening, as twilight spilled gold across the rooftops and the workshop glowed warm beneath its flickering lamp, Amina noticed for the first time that the threads on the table didn't just look like colors. They looked like paths, each one leading somewhere different, intertwining here and there like lifelines crossing in the hands of fate. And she asked softly, "Mama, do you think the spirits truly see us?" The seamstress did not pause her stitching, but her voice grew deep, carrying the weight of remembered pain and hard-earned wisdom as she replied, "They see every child who is pushed aside. They watch, they wait, and when someone stands up, they move." And Amina, who had once felt invisible enough to disappear, felt something warm swell in her chest, like a small flame blooming. As the days melted into weeks, more girls arrived at the workshop, and the room filled with the laughter, tears, and whispered dreams of those who had once been silent. And together they learned not just to sew, but to mend, themselves, each other, their place in the world. And though the villagers did not speak of it openly, they all felt the change. The nights were calmer, the rains gentler, the elders smiled more, and even the trees seemed to rustle with softer voices. Because in a forgotten corner of Mwangaza, a forgotten girl and a once-forgotten seamstress had begun stitching something larger than destiny. They were stitching a village awake. By the time Amina reached her final year at the school that once cast her out, the village had already begun speaking her name with a tone that mixed pride and disbelief. For the girl who had once hidden in the back of her classroom now wrote essays that made teachers pause mid-sentence, won competitions that brought strangers visiting the school, and carried herself with the quiet composure of someone who had been reshaped by struggle rather than crushed by it. Yet even as her brilliance grew like a sunrise over the hills of Mwangaza, the school administration whispered nervously about her, worried that honoring her achievements might stir up memories of the day they unjustly expelled her, memories they preferred to bury beneath speeches and polished floors. But destiny has a habit of reopening doors people try to shut. And so on the week of graduation, when the teachers met in the staff room to choose the student who would deliver the ceremonial speech, Amina's name rose again and again, undeniable, luminous, the room thick with the truth they could not swallow, that the girl they once rejected had outshone every expectation. Madame Sepu, perched stiffly in her chair with her elbows tight against her sides, forced a smile and said, "Yes, let her speak," though the words tasted like stones in her mouth. But when another teacher timidly asked if they should invite Mama Halima to attend the ceremony, after all, she helped the girls so much, the principal's expression hardened like sun-baked clay, and she waved the idea away with a cold flick of her hand, saying, "This is an academic event, not a village gathering. Let us keep things orderly." And though no one dared challenge her openly, a hush spread through the room, a hush that carried the faint rustle of restless spirits who did not appreciate being dismissed. On the evening of graduation, the sky darkened earlier than usual, heavy clouds gathering overhead like an audience waiting for a performance. And as the villagers arrived at the school, decorated with ribbons and lanterns, a strange energy buzzed through the courtyard, the kind that made old women whisper, "Tonight, the spirits walk with us," while the younger ones simply felt a prickling in their bones. Inside the hall, chairs were arranged in perfect lines, the stage polished until it reflected the lantern light, and the teachers hovered nervously as music played from a small speaker, trying to maintain control of an evening that already belonged to forces beyond their reach. Amina entered wearing a blue dress sewn by her own hands under the watchful guidance of Mama Halima, a dress made of scrap fabric donated by neighbors, stitched with patience, memory, and faint threads of gold that shimmered when the lanterns caught them. And as she walked through the crowd, people silently parted for her, sensing not just her accomplishments, but the roots of her story, the soil she had risen from, the woman who had held her hand through storms. Meanwhile, at the back of the hall, unnoticed by the teachers who fluttered about like worried chickens, the doors opened quietly and Mama Halima stepped inside. Wearing a simple dark wrapper and carrying the grace of someone who knows her worth without needing applause, her presence drawing attention the way a candle draws moths, soft but undeniable. And one by one, the villagers began to rise from their seats, forming a wave of respect that rippled across the hall, until even those who didn't know why found themselves standing, their palms pressed together, their faces softened, and the murmured phrase, "Mama Halima don come," spreading like a blessing. Madame Sepu, seeing the crowd's reaction, felt her stomach tighten and her cheeks flush with heat, because she understood now that control was slipping through her fingers like sand. But before she could shoo the seamstress away, the lanterns flickered, not once but 3 times, long enough for the room to fall into a hush so deep it felt like an inhaled breath held by unseen lungs. And in that trembling silence, the elders present exchanged knowing glances. "Ah, the ancestors greet her," they whispered. Amina stepped onto the stage at that exact moment, and the flickering ceased, the air settling as if waiting for her words, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every girl who had ever been silenced. She told the story of a child who once came to school with a torn uniform and dry bread wrapped in old newspaper, a child who was cast out not for misbehavior, but for being poor. And she paused then, letting the truth settle into the room like dust into sunlight before continuing. "That day, someone saw me when the world looked away," and she lifted her gaze toward Mama Halima, whose eyes gleamed with unshed tears. The villagers followed her gaze, the teachers swallowed hard, and even Madame Sepu seemed smaller somehow, as if the truth had shrunk her authority. Amina ended her speech not with revenge, but with gratitude, saying, "Dignity was stitched back into me by hands that never pushed me aside." And the hall thundered with applause, raw, rising, unrestrained, so loud it drowned out the music, shaking the windows, rattling the lanterns, and carrying deep into the night, while the spirits, satisfied, drifted through the room in warm currents of wind that made the ribbons sway as though bowing in respect to the girl and the woman who had changed the destiny of a village through thread, courage, and love. In the months after graduation, as the applause of that unforgettable night softened into memory, life in Mongaza settled into a quieter rhythm. Yet beneath the surface, something profound had changed. For the village that once ignored the suffering of its poorest children now looked toward the small workshop of Mama Halima with reverence, as though it were a shrine rather than a sewing room. But time, as it always does, began to tug gently at the seamstress's aging body, her hands trembling more often, her breath shortening, until one morning she simply did not rise from her bed, slipping into the ancestors' embrace with the same quiet dignity she had lived by. The village gathered to mourn her with genuine tears, and among them, Amina wept not only for the woman who had saved her life, but for the mother she had been given by fate, a mother who taught her that thread could mend more than cloth. It could mend futures. After the burial, the workshop sat silent for days, dust settling over the sewing machine like a thin veil of grief. But Amina knew that places touched by true goodness never stay empty for long, and so one morning she opened the creaking door, swept the floor, arranged the scraps, and uncovered the old machine, pressing her palm to the cool metal as though greeting an old friend, whispering, "I will continue." And with that, the room seemed to inhale again, as if awakened. Word spread quickly that the workshop had reopened, though it was no longer Halima's. It was Amina's now, and soon girls from every corner of the village appeared at the doorway, some timid, some hopeful, some carrying torn dresses, others carrying torn confidence, and Amina welcomed each one with the same ritual she had been taught, placing a clean piece of cloth on the table and saying, "Sit, you are safe here." And slowly, a new chapter began. The sewing machine, once a humble tool of survival, became an instrument of transformation, stitching uniforms for girls who had been told they did not belong in school, repairing clothes for children who believed poverty made them invisible, and every time Amina embroidered the hidden phrase inside a collar, "You are worth more than they said," she felt Mama Halima's hand guiding hers. One afternoon, a hesitant knock came at the door, and when Amina opened it, she found a girl standing with a crumpled dress in her hands and a woman beside her whose eyes were familiar. Madame Sepu, the former principal, her pride now worn thin by life and regret, her voice trembling as she said, "My daughter, she needs help." And for a moment the past hovered between them like a shadow, but Amina simply stepped aside and replied, "All girls are welcome," choosing mercy over bitterness, because wounds heal fastest when stitched with grace. By sunset, the workshop was filled with laughter, stories, and the rhythmic hum of the machine. And as Amina looked around, at the girls learning, at the scraps turning into beauty, at the sunlight resting gently on the old sewing table, she realized that Mama Halima had never truly left, for her spirit lived in every thread, every stitch, every girl who walked in broken and walked out whole. And the village of Mwangaza, once asleep to its own cruelty, now pulsed with a new truth, that when even one woman chooses to stand against injustice, she becomes a light bright enough to guide a generation home.